Hello everyone, Dr. Sparkle here, and welcome to Chrontendo Episode 1, the Revised Edition. Now what's this, you say? Revised Edition? Well yes, back in 2007, when I did the very first episode of Chrontendo, I wasn't really satisfied with the results, especially concerning the sound, so I've gone ahead and basically re-recorded Chrontendo Episode 1. It's basically just a newer, improved version of that same original episode. For those of you just now tuning in, Chrontendo is an attempt to play every single game released for the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Famicom as it was called in Japan, and we'll be playing all these rather just looking at them in chronological order. This will hopefully allow us to learn something about one of the most beloved video game consoles of all time, as well as a bit about the history of Nintendo and sort of video game development in general. But first, let's start off by taking a brief look at the history of Nintendo themselves. Nintendo was actually founded way back in 1889 in Kyoto. The original purpose of the company was to produce Hanafuda decks, which is a sort of Japanese playing card. Over the years, they diversified a bit. They came out with Western styles of playing cards, and tried their hand at other things, like a taxi company and a chain of hotels. But really, for the first half of the 20th century, Nintendo was primarily a card manufacturer. Probably the most significant person in the history of Nintendo was Hiroshi Yamauchi, the grandson of the original founder. When he took over the company in 1956, that's really when Nintendo began to change its focus. One figure who was instrumental in this massive change was Gunpei Yokoi. He designed an enormously popular toy called the Ultra Hand. After the success of the Ultra Hand, Nintendo sort of switched its focus to mostly become a toy company. Yokoi himself designed many of these early toys, including some very early versions of Nintendo light guns. Nintendo also moved on into electronics, and by the end of the 70s had moved into the arcade video game field. As was standard practice, most of their early arcade games were very derivative of other arcade hits, such as Space Invaders. Of course, all of this changed, mostly due to a young man named Shigeru Miyamoto. Miyamoto would eventually become Nintendo's preeminent personality and game designer, and one of the most influential figures in the history of video gaming. His career took off when he was called in to design a video game that could be converted from unsold copies of a game called Radarscope. Depending on whom you ask, Radarscope was either an enormous hit in Japan that failed to sell any copies in the US, or was just an overall flop. Either way, Nintendo of America had a whole bunch of these things sitting in their warehouse, and they requested a conversion kit so that these could be changed into a different new game. The resulting game, Donkey Kong, was released to arcades in 1981 and was a huge hit in both the US and Japan. It was unlike any other game on the market and created the vogue for what we now call platform games. Nintendo followed up Donkey Kong with more arcade hits, like Donkey Kong Jr. and Popeye. Now for a while, Nintendo had also been interested in getting into the home console market. They had released some Pong clones under the name TV Game in the late 70s. And shortly thereafter, a series of handheld LED games designed by Gunpei Yokoi hit the market. Yokoi would eventually design something called the Game Boy, but Game & Watch was the first entry for Nintendo into the world of portable gaming. Finally, in 1983, Nintendo unveiled its cartridge-based console, the Family Computer, or the Famicom for short. A few years later, it would be released in the US in a redesigned form as the Nintendo Entertainment System. The Japanese Famicom has a rather eye-catching red and white color scheme, as well as two controllers that are actually hardwired into the console. Now back in 1983, the Famicom was a pretty sophisticated system. It featured an 8-bit processor, 2 kilobytes of RAM, and could display 16 colors and 64 sprites on the screen at one time. The Japanese home video game market was pretty much untapped at this point, and the Famicom was an instant success. Let's start back in the glorious year of 1983 on July 15th. The Famicom debuted that day with 3 games as launch titles. Like most new systems, releases for the Famicom came pretty slowly at first. There were a total of 9 games released in 1983. And a quick word about the Famicom cartridges. The Famicom games are a completely different size and shape than the US and Nintendo Entertainment System carts. As you can see, they're sort of short and squat, and fit snugly into the Famicom game boxes, which tend to sort of be longer than they are tall. Alright, well, let's get going. Here it is, the very first game for the Nintendo Famicom, a port of their arcade game Donkey Kong. This was one of 3 launch titles for the system. Note the sort of weird music playing during the title screen, and this even has sort of like an attract mode. If you don't touch anything, you'll start seeing a little demo of the game playing. It's almost like Nintendo thinks it's making an arcade game somehow. Once you press a button, the actual game will start, and then you'll find you're playing an extremely accurate and convincing port of Donkey Kong. I'm going to assume that perhaps the major selling point of the Famicom when it first came out was, hey, you can play games like Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. at home, and it's just like playing the arcade version. This certainly makes sense if you think about it. 2 of the biggest selling titles for the Atari 2600 were ports of Space Invaders and Pac-Man. The original Donkey Kong, designed by Shigeru Miyamoto, hit arcades in 1981. Am I the only guy who's ever been bothered by the fact that Donkey Kong looks completely different on the how high can you get screen? Well, doing a side-by-side comparison, here's the Famicom version again, you'll see just how close this thing was. There were, of course, a few compromises. For example, I assume to save space, the little sort of introductory sequence with Donkey Kong climbing the building has been cut. And an entire level, the so-called Pie Factory, has been removed as well. But still, this must have astonished gamers when they first saw it. As a point of comparison, let's take a look at some of the earlier home versions of Donkey Kong. Here, for example, is the old Atari 2600. Really not that old, it came out in 1982, but it's only a rough approximation of the actual Donkey Kong game. The ColecoVision Donkey Kong, by contrast, was a major selling point for the console. This was considered near miraculous in its fidelity to the arcade game, even though certainly there are some differences, like the fact that little barrels don't explode when you hit them with a hammer. I'm going to assume that everyone out there more or less knows how to play Donkey Kong. You control Mario, or Jumpman as he was called in the original version. You need to climb to the top of these various levels, avoiding things like barrels and the other things that Donkey Kong throws at you. Here's the final level here. You gotta remove all those rivets that are holding the platforms in place, which will cause Donkey Kong to fall on his head. In terms of historical importance, Donkey Kong was the first platform game, the game that sort of brought Nintendo to America, the game that introduced both Donkey Kong and Mario. You might say that virtually all of Nintendo's later successes were sort of built on the foundation of Donkey Kong. So this is a pretty auspicious start for the Famicom. And naturally, the second game to be released for the Famicom, once again a launch title, was Donkey Kong Jr., the 1982 sequel to the original Donkey Kong. As before, we have that sort of generic looking title screen and like a little arcade style demo mode. Donkey Kong was perhaps a bit harder than the first game, certainly had a bit more variety in the type of play. One thing to remember, this was actually a pretty new game. It hit arcades in 1982. Let's take a look at the original arcade version here. Mario has captured Donkey Kong and is keeping him in a cage. The main question here is, who is the second Mario? Is that Luigi, dressed in red? It's always been a bit of a mystery. This game portrays Mario as a whip-wielding villain, sending all these weird little creatures after Donkey Kong Jr. Something else you may have wondered is, what exactly is Donkey Kong Jr. wearing? Is that some little kind of white outfit on? It's odd that a monkey would be wearing clothing. As I mentioned, Donkey Kong Jr. is kind of a tough game. Falling more than about 1 centimeter will kill you, and there's various things that will fall on you or hit you. The gameplay has been changed a bit from the original Donkey Kong. There's still some running and jumping, but the game is also sort of based around the mechanics of climbing ropes or chains. All the climbing actually reminds me of the various vines and whatnot you would find in the Super Mario games. Just like Donkey Kong, there were some cuts made to the home version. The little introductory sequences are not there. You don't get to see Mario pulling up Donkey Kong in the cage while some Bach organ music plays. It's interesting to note that while Donkey Kong Jr. was a pretty big arcade hit, Nintendo's future was a little shaky at this point. They were currently in the middle of a lawsuit with Universal over the use of Donkey Kong. Universal was claiming that this was based on King Kong, which supposedly they had the copyright to. They sued Nintendo, gave them a cease and desist order, and this was not resolved until 1984, and I think the appeals actually dragged on until 1986. Nintendo won and got some damages from Universal. Okay, so going back to the game here, we're about at the final level. This is it here. It involves climbing chains and pushing keys. Up into the locks there, this will free Donkey Kong and send Mario tumbling. After this, the levels will just repeat, just like in Donkey Kong. Evil Mario has been defeated. Hopefully this is the last we'll ever hear of that guy. And the third and final launch title for the Famicom was Popeye, yet another port of a 1982 Nintendo arcade game. This one perhaps not quite so successful as Donkey Kong or Donkey Kong Jr., but I certainly remember seeing it quite a bit in the arcades back in the day. All these games have very similar title screens. Nintendo sort of was aiming for like some kind of consistency across their releases, with the virtually identical title screens, the little music, very similar box art. Once again, the arcade game was designed by Shigeru Miyamoto. He originally wanted to make a Donkey Kong based on Popeye, but couldn't get the rights. If you look at the intro here, you'll see little things like word balloons and a bit more of a little story being told between Popeye and Bluto and Olive Oil. Unfortunately, the Famicom version couldn't quite capture this. Popeye is definitely the best looking of the three arcade games that are on display here, and the Famicom wasn't quite able to capture this. As we can see, the visuals take a bit of a hit. This is not quite the accurate port that Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. was. The object here is to catch all the various objects that Olive Oil throws at you while avoiding Bluto. There is a spinach that will appear once per level. If you grab that, you can then knock Bluto out and send him crashing into the ocean. This will buy you a few moments of extra time. Also, you can't let the objects fall into the ocean and get wet, otherwise you'll lose. Later levels get a bit more difficult, 3 levels altogether. One interesting little footnote, Popeye, along with Donkey Kong and a few other titles, were supposedly co-developed by a Japanese electronics company called Ikegami Tsushinki. They apparently did some of the coding for this game, and when Nintendo proceeded to duplicate this code, Ikegami sued them. The lawsuit was not resolved until 1989. Well, with Popeye, that wraps up the launch of the Famicom. Let's now fast forward to August 1983 for the first original titles for the system. Alright Nintendo, so you just released ports of your 3 big arcade hits for your new console. What are you gonna do next? Well, like video game publishers everywhere, you released some versions of non-copyrighted board games. In this case, it's Gomoku Narabe Renju. Gomoku is actually a pretty simple little game that's actually played on a Go board using Go pieces, but it's much simpler than the game Go. The object here is that black and white take turns putting down pieces, and you're going to try to get 5 pieces in a row. The rules are that black goes first. Now there is sort of a catch. It turns out that if black goes first, they can always win. Therefore, this is actually a variation of Gomoku called Renju. This is Gomoku with a few extra rules and restrictions in place that will prevent whoever goes first from always winning. Gomoku, just like Go, is an old Chinese game, but the name Gomoku is Japanese. It means something like 5 pieces line up. If you're a kid that grew up in the US, you'll probably think this game looks a lot like Connect 4. There's a few different options on this cart. You can play against the computer, you can play against another person. I'm playing against the computer here, and it turns out I'm actually not a very good Gomoku player. It's funny, I would always beat my cousin at Connect 4. Guess the computer's a bit smarter than my cousin. The game does give you little hints, like when the computer's about to get 5 in a row, their pieces will start flashing. Now, the first 3 games we saw were all released in the US for the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985. But Gomoku Narabe is the first Japan-only title for the Famicom. Obviously, when Nintendo of America was picking out potential releases for US release, they decided to pass this one over. This is something we'll see a lot of in Chrontendo. Certain games will have sort of like a universal appeal like Donkey Kong, and certain games Nintendo decides simply only the Japanese will be interested in playing. Of course, game fans and publishers often disagree as to what games they would like to play, leading to a lot of frustration in the United States and Europe over all the great games released in Japan but not over here. With this one though, I don't really think that we're missing that much. Sure, this is a fun little game to play, but nothing too spectacular. Released the same day as Gomoku Narabe is Mahjong. Now if you're like most Westerners, you've probably never actually played the game of Mahjong. You may have played that game that comes on Windows computers, but that's not the actual game of Mahjong. That's just sort of a matching game that uses the Mahjong tiles. It's been released under various names over the years, such as Shanghai or Solitaire Mahjong. Mahjong is sort of like a card game, only instead of being played with cards, it's played with small painted tiles. There are several suites. For example, here you see I have quite a few of the bamboo suite. Other suites have a series of dots on them, or Chinese characters. Now, this is not the first Mahjong video game. Mahjong games were among the very first video games made in Japan. For example, here's Royal Mahjong from Nichibutsu, originally released back in 1981. In real life, Mahjong is normally played with 4 people. Though, since the advent of computer games, a certain special variation on Mahjong has emerged, in which you play one-on-one head-to-head with the computer. Now the odds are that you probably don't play Mahjong, and I certainly don't play Mahjong. Seems like here in the United States the only folks who play it are little old Jewish ladies, so I can't really tell you too much about whether this is a good version of the game or not. I suppose it looks decent, but in Asia, Mahjong video games are enormously popular, so it's not too surprising that one of the very first games Nintendo released for the Famicom was in fact a Mahjong game. It certainly paid off for Nintendo. This was one of the biggest selling titles over the entire system's lifespan. And I should point out that over the course of Chrontendo, we'll be seeing many, many more Mahjong games. And hot on the heels of Mahjong comes Mario Brothers. No, not that game, the original Mario Brothers. This game is notable for a lot of reasons. It's the first game where Mario sort of steps out of the shadows of Donkey Kong. Also notable for being the first game where Luigi is introduced. A few recurring themes in the Mario series sort of make their debut here. Once again, Mario Brothers is a port, but it's actually a port of a pretty recent title. The arcade Mario Brothers came out in 1983, same year as this Famicom version. The Famicom couldn't quite apparently replicate that rather fancy little title screen there. Much like the Donkey Kong games and Popeye, Mario Brothers is a pretty good-looking port. Obviously the colors are a bit more brighter in the arcade version. There's a bit more detail, but compared to what we've been seeing, well, here for example is the Atari 2600 port of Mario Brothers. This came out in 1983 as well. And while this is clearly Mario Brothers, it's certainly been compromised quite a bit. So what's going on here? Well, back in Donkey Kong, Mario was apparently a carpenter. Now he's gotten a new job as a plumber, and there's some sort of major plumbing emergency going on, with all kinds of turtles and crabs and fireballs coming out of the pipes. Mario's job? Well, rather than fix the plumbing, better kill all the animals that are coming out. Oh, and here's a bonus level here with the object to collect coins. The coins being one of the things that sort of debuted in this game, along with Luigi, as seen here, and of course the Koopas, which in this game are actually called shell creepers. Mario Brothers is a collaboration between Shigeru Miyamoto and Gunpei Yokoi. Apparently Yokoi came up with some of the basic design ideas, like having multiple levels here, and of course Mario not dying if he falls off one of the platforms. Of course, in comparison to the later Mario games, the jumping mechanics are actually quite primitive. Once in midair, you cannot control your jump at all. Well, Mario Brothers was the last of Nintendo's big arcade hits that were ported to the system, which raises the obvious question, what were they going to do next? Okay, let's set the stage here. It's late November 1983. there hasn't been a new game released for the Famicom in 2.5 months. Nintendo has already ported all its big arcade hits to the system. What are they going to do now? Start porting stuff like Radar Scope? They can't exactly ask Miyamoto to crank out a new game every 2 weeks. But still, they have to have something on this new console, don't they? Well, the solution is obvious. Just rip some of the sprites from one of their existing titles and make a brand new game. And because of course it's a family computer, it's supposed to be good for kids, not turn their brains into mush, it's going to be an educational game, this time starring Popeye. So as a result, we get Popeye no Eigo Asobi. And of course, if you don't remember this game from when you were a young person, that's because it was only released in Japan. It's a game that's supposed to teach Japanese kids English alphabet and words. You start by choosing a category, and then a word will come up. Then Popeye runs around and selects the correct letters. Shows you the word in Japanese, and you have to translate it into English. Every time he gets a letter wrong, Bluto will punch the punching bag and knock Sweet Pea a little bit closer to the edge there. I love the charming little skulls that appear whenever you choose the wrong letter. Nowadays, I think that the suggestion of harming an infant in such a fashion might be considered a bit taboo for games, but let's see what actually happens. Will Sweet Pea actually drown? Oh, thank goodness. Saved just in time. There's a few different gameplay variations here. Other than the one we just saw, this next one here doesn't actually show you the word in Japanese, only has the English word, so it might be a bit difficult to guess what the word is going to be. You're going to have to pick a few random letters first and hope you get lucky. And the last gameplay variation is one for 2 players only. You and Bluto compete to catch letters that Olive Oil is throwing. This one is set in the Sea Hags level. Well, I guess we do learn something from this. Even in Japan, educational games are really not a whole lot of fun. We enter the all-important month of December with baseball. This would be the first sports game from Nintendo. Make a note of that music because we'll be hearing the exact same music in the game Tennis. Now as we start the game here, notice that it actually allows you to choose your team, represented by those little letters there. We'll discuss that in more detail in just a moment. Now it's a long-standing video game tradition that when game makers come out with a new console, usually one of the very first things they do is put out some sports games on it. And that's exactly what Nintendo is doing. We're going to be covering baseball, tennis, and golf this episode. If you think about it, this makes sense. I mean, Nintendo didn't want to invest too many resources into creating brand new games, so they just sort of stuck with some of the standard formulas while they waited to see how the whole thing kind of worked out. Baseball video games have been around for quite some time, going back to the very earliest days of home consoles. There have also been some baseball arcade games. Let's take a look at some now. Here, for example, is Double Play from Midway from 1977. A lot of early baseball games tended to look kind of like this. Major advances in sports games were made with the release of the Intellivision, which was known for its reasonably realistic sports games. Here is All-Star Major League Baseball. This was considered to be pretty hot stuff back in the day. This is, I suppose, a somewhat reasonable, facsimile of how baseball is actually played. Now let's take a look at something for the ColecoVision Super Action Baseball from 1983. The ColecoVision was the most graphically advanced home console at the time, though in this case the game suffers from a pretty ugly color scheme and horrible little animations of the characters running around. And then suddenly, 1 year later, we jump to this. Wow, what a difference! Look at the players, they have like uniforms on and everything. And relatively realistic animations. And furthermore, the game even has 2 different camera angles. When you're batting or pitching, the camera is sort of zoomed in right on the diamond. When you hit a ball, it then suddenly goes back out and you can see the entire outfield. You can see a scoreboard in the background, you can see people in the audience, it's very nice. Now, like a lot of early baseball games, the controls on this are pretty simple. You mostly just control the pitcher and the batter. You use the button to either swing the bat or throw the pitch, The D-pad will let you move your bat around a bit, or give you a certain amount of control over the kind of pitch, fastball to the left, to the right. You have a very limited control over the players in the outfield. Once they have the ball, use the D-pad to control the throw. For example, pressing up will throw to second base, pressing right will throw to first base, and so on. Now, of course, back then, if you take a look at this game, like nowhere in the game or on the box, are there any sorts of names of baseball players, or any names of sports teams, or anything that would have to be licensed. This game is in no way affiliated with any sort of like Major League Baseball team or product. But it still does, in sort of a sly way, refer to actual teams. Like, for example, it shows you the first letter of each team's names. Now here, for example, D is presumably the Dodgers, based on their uniform color scheme. So even though the game doesn't actually mention the Dodgers, you can still sort of feel like you're playing them. But still, I don't believe there's any sort of like differences between the teams in terms of stats or anything like that. The only real differences are simply the colors of the uniforms. Well, I'd say baseball is all in all a pretty good game, and for Nintendo's first sports game, it is pretty impressive. For our final game of 1983, we have one that you probably hated if your parents got it for you back then. It's Donkey Kong Jr. no Sansu Asobi, or as we call it in the US, Donkey Kong Jr. Math. And yep, just like that Popeye game, this is an educational game. And it was undoubtedly a quickie game that was made simply so they could reuse some of the sprites from Donkey Kong Jr. Well, so anyway, if you don't recall this game, this is how it works. It displays a number up at the top of the screen, and you're supposed to jump around and collect the numbers and the mathematical symbols in order to get everything to add up to that particular number. For example, here we're supposed to get 77. We already have 9, so we're going to grab the time symbol and then grab 8. That'll take us up to 72. Then all we have to do after that is to find 5 and add that. Now this is a 2-player game only, so the pink Donkey Kong, I assume that's Donkey Kong Jr.'s sister, should also be trying to do the exact same thing at the same time. There is a second option on the title screen. That's simply the exact same game except the numbers involved are larger. And there's one last final option as well. Either way, this is probably not a game you really would have enjoyed playing, back in 1985 when it came out in the United States, and it's probably not a game that you would really enjoy playing now. Presumably Nintendo created these games so they could, like I said earlier, reuse some existing sprites and to make a game that was very educational, but they pretty much dropped the whole educational game thing almost immediately. From this point forward, generally speaking, educational games would be left to other publishers. By the time 1984 opened, it was pretty clear the Famicom was going to be a success in Japan. Despite that, this year still started kind of slowly for releases. In fact, only 6 games were released in the first half of 1984, as compared to 9 games for the previous 6 months. In fact, we really won't see the pace of new Famicom games pick up until pretty late in 1984. Alright, so let's get January 1984 rolling with Tennis. This was in fact the only game released in January. Now one thing you may have noticed here is Nintendo is sort of trying to go for like a house style with their title screens. They all look pretty much the same. They have like a very simple logo, a couple different play options, the copyright Nintendo against a black background. Usually a short little musical tune will be playing. Eventually they would get a bit more creative, but for the time being this is sort of like the look that they were going for. Also the Famicom box art had a very similar feel to it as well. All the box art kind of looked the same. So anyway, here we have Tennis, which is obviously based on the real-life game of tennis. Now I've got to confess, I usually don't really like video games based around tennis. I guess part of the problem is that, you have to sort of depict a 3D reality, a ball moving towards you, in a 2-dimensional video game, which is really not that easy, especially back at this time. But here, Nintendo does manage to do a pretty admirable job. They've depicted the tennis court from a top-down perspective, but it's sort of slightly angled. There's a bit of perspective in the court. For the tennis ball, they actually use several different sprites, so it gets bigger as it comes towards you, and as it recedes, it just becomes a tiny dot. There's also a shadow on the ball, which gives you some assistance in determining how high off the ground the ball is. and the shadow also gets smaller and larger. So from a strictly technical perspective, the game is pretty impressive in the way it tries to depict the ball moving back and forth in space. Now something else interesting here, the referee looks a lot like Mario. Well, he's a little short guy with a mustache. He's not dressed like Mario, but this does appear to be Mario's first kind of cameo appearance in a sports game. Nintendo would later go on to put him in all their golf games. So it appears even at this early stage, Mario was essentially the Nintendo mascot. The game plays pretty simply. Move your figure back and forth using the D-pad. Use the button to swing. If you hit the button like hard or softly, that'll sort of control the strength of the swing just a bit. The title screen allows you to select the difficulty option. Back then, video games had a whole lot of difficulty options. I mean, they still do nowadays, but in the days of the 2600, for example, there are always like 50 different options on every video game. So while tennis isn't exactly fantastic, it still plays pretty good, and I'd say it's a lot better than some of the other third-party tennis games that would eventually come out for the system. Alright, so you've done some basic board games, you've got a few sports games on the system, so what's next? Well, something a lot of video game developers would do would be to create a pinball game. At this time, the early 80s, pinball was still quite popular in the arcades. A lot of decent-sized video arcades would have some pinball tables in there as well, and of course they had been in arcades much longer than video games. Thus we have Nintendo's Pinball. Now something that's a little cool and different here is that this game actually has two screens. There's sort of like a top half and a bottom half. When the ball drops down below, it goes into the lower screen, and if you shoot it back up, it goes back into the top screen. This allowed Nintendo to sort of create a bigger pinball table. Now how does the thing control? Well, it's sort of a unique setup. With your right hand, you can hit either of the two buttons. This will control the right flipper. With your left hand, you control the D-pad. Doesn't matter which direction you push it in, this will do the left flipper. So this gives the game somewhat of a feel like a real pinball machine. Now if you saw the American cover there a moment ago, you might be wondering, why is Mario on the cover? What's he have to do this game? Well, he actually does have another cameo, just like tennis. Though this one's a bit more hidden. I guess this might be one of the first examples of like a hidden minigame inside a larger game. Of course, it's really not that well hidden. In fact, if you play this for a little while, you'll eventually come across it, mostly by accident. On the bottom screen, kind of near the upper right-hand corner, there's like a little hole that you can shoot your ball into. If you get lucky and get your ball there, you'll actually go into this little minigame, which is kind of sort of like Breakout. What it is Mario will be holding a platform on his head. You can move him back and forth, try to bounce the ball off the platform, and free Pauline from the prison above. Now, this was a bit before Princess Peach entered the picture, so Pauline is still Mario's main love interest. So anyway, I guess that Pinball is probably a pretty minor early Famicom title. It certainly wasn't bad. On the other hand, like in 1983, EA had released Pinball Construction Set, which is a game that's a lot more fondly remembered. And later on, you'd see stuff like for the TurboGrafx 16 like Alien Crush, which were much more interesting games. Still, Nintendo hasn't exactly made a whole lot of pinball video games, so I suppose that in a way this is sort of a unique title. The other game to be released in February 1984 is Wild Gunman. Now, Wild Gunman is interesting for a few different reasons. First of all, this is not exactly a port of an earlier arcade game, nor is it based on a board game or a sport, so I suppose it's one of the earlier original titles for the Famicom. But also, check this out. Yeah, there's an honest-to-God speech sample in this, almost unheard of at the time. There were a few games for the Intellivision that used its special speech synthesizer, but it was still pretty rare. Now, as I mentioned, Wild Gunman was more or less the original title, but it was based on a much earlier, sort of not video game, but arcade game called Wild Gunman that Nintendo released back in 1974. This had an actual 16mm film that played, and then you shot at it, though the basic idea is the same as the Famicom game. And of course, if you've seen Back to the Future Part 2, you will see a special Wild Gunman freestanding arcade cabinet That was never actually produced for real arcades. Apparently it was made just for the movie for some reason. But perhaps most interesting of all was the fact that you control this game by using a light gun. Yes, this game was the debut of the Nintendo light gun. Now take a look at what the original Japanese Famicom light gun looks like. I mean, wow, it looks just like a real gun. It looks like a Colt or something. Really nothing at all like that crazy orange zapper that came with the Nintendo Entertainment System. I guess in the United States at that time you really couldn't get away with making your toy guns look like real guns. So how does the game actually play? Well, very simply, each round one of these bad guys marches out and you have to shoot them. Well, don't worry, you don't actually kill them. You always just like shoot their hat off or their pants off or something like that. Now it is possible to shoot too fast. If you shoot before the guy is ready, you'll get a foul and you'll lose the round. Likewise, if you get shot, you lose the round as well. And there's also a harder difficulty setting in which they come out 2 at a time. And finally, difficulty option C is the gang setting. That's where you're not out in the desert, you're actually in a town, in front of a saloon, and the bad guys will sort of open up various windows and doors and shoot at you. This particular kind of layout would sort of be the standard for most light gun games. It usually involves quick reflexes and having to shoot an enemy as soon as he appears on the screen. So while Gunman isn't exactly the most interesting or exciting light gun game, it is the first one on the system. And I mean, back then, of course, well, Nintendo had been developing light gun toys and whatnot for quite some time, as well as light gun arcade games, but a light gun home console game was pretty much unheard of at this time. The light gun would go on to become quite popular in the US, but not so much with this game, but rather with the next game we're going to see. As you may have noticed there a second ago, Duck Hunt came out on April 21st. That's over 2 months after Wild Gunman. Why the big long delay between games? Well, I don't really know, but it couldn't have been because they were putting a whole lot of time into this game. Duck Hunt is probably about the simplest game Nintendo ever released, though I mean, it does look pretty nice. I'd say the most memorable thing about this game is probably the way that dog sticks its head up and laughs at you every time you miss a duck. And of course it has that sort of catchy but incredibly short piece of music that plays. Out of all the games Nintendo developed, this must be the one with the least amount of music written for it. Now if you had a NES back in the day, you probably remember this game. In fact, when it was first released in the United States, this game was a pack-in title in the version of the Nintendo that came with the Zapper. I'm sure a lot of people never bought another Zapper game, so this is the one they probably think of when they think of the light gun games. I suppose there is a certain sort of genius in its simplicity. Really, all that happens in this game is 2 ducks fly up and you try to shoot them. If you miss, the dog will laugh at you. Now there is a slightly more challenging mode in this, the one that probably most of you guys didn't play. It's the clay pigeon shooting. It's a bit more difficult, but the screen is also incredibly dull and boring looking. I mean, for such a classic title, I really don't think Nintendo put a whole lot of time into this. Now at some point, somewhat Nintendo realized that what players really wanted to do is to shoot the darn dog. So when this came out in the arcade version, it was like one of those Play Choice 10 titles, you actually could shoot the dog, though of course he would get upset if you did. Okay, and we do actually have one more light gun game coming up in just a few minutes. The only game to be released in May of 1984, it's Nintendo's Golf, the third title in Nintendo's Sports Series. One thing you might notice here is that Golf is entirely devoid of any sort of music whatsoever. I mean, there are some sound effects, but there's no music during the title screen or during the game itself. This might be considered evidence that Nintendo were stretching themselves a bit thin when it comes to getting out all these games. Well, anyway, Nintendo's Golf introduces a control scheme that would become pretty much standard for golf games on the system. You use the D-pad to select which golf club you want to use, and use the left and right on the D-pad to control sort of the general direction of your swing. Golf also uses a very interesting mechanic to actually control your swing. You press the button once to move your club back. Once you've got it back far enough, press it again to move it forward, and then press it a third time right when the arrow reaches those little group of white lines on the meter below you. The second button press will control the power of the swing. The further you let it go back, the stronger your swing will be. Pressing the button again when the little arrow is right in that little group of white boxes there will make your swing more accurate. If you press it too early or too late, you will either hook or slice the ball. But this rather unique control scheme makes golf a little revolutionary. Of course, there had been golf video games before this. For example, there were some games on the 2600, and there were some arcade golf games as well, but this mechanism used to hit the ball is actually quite new. Some of the older arcade games used a trackball. That is, you'd hit the ball and then you'd move the trackball as fast as you could in order to get the golf ball to move. And of course, there are lots of nice little realistic touches, like you can tell which direction the wind is blowing. There are water traps, sand traps, all that sort of thing. Now in comparison to using the regular golf clubs, putting is a little bit different. As you see, there's no white boxes. You can't really sort of cause your ball to go astray using putting, but you can hit it not hard enough or too hard and it'll go right past the hole. And also the greens tend to sort of have a little bit of a slant to them. The arrows on the green will show you which direction the green is sort of graded. So when you hit your ball, it won't necessarily go completely straight. It can go downhill a bit and miss the hole. And of course, as you may have figured out, I guess this guy is supposed to be Mario. Probably looking as unlike Mario as he ever has. Also very clearly depicted here as being sort of a chubby fellow. On the Japanese box art, you don't see his face, and he doesn't look like Mario whatsoever. On the US box art, he was clearly drawn as being Mario. I guess it is a little weird to see Mario dressed up in civilian clothing. In Japan, this game was quite successful. It sold, I think, several million copies, one of the better-selling games of the system as far as I'm aware. It certainly influenced enough other golf games. Most of the subsequent games on the Famicom really seemed kind of like a slight variation on this one. Nintendo themselves would go on to release numerous golf games, all of which were very similar to this. By today's standards, the game is a little on the simple side, but it still plays pretty well. From June 1984, it's our last game this episode, Hogan's Alley. The game that's so complicated actually requires a individual sort of training screen that shows you what targets to hit and what targets not to hit. Hogan's Alley is, once again, a light gun game. The object here is to, well, basically shoot the bad guys. This is sort of like a training simulator here for cops or something like that. These little cardboard figures slide out, and you want to shoot the ones that look villainous and not shoot the ones that look like friendly old men or little ladies or cops. You'll look down at the bottom there, you'll notice there's a miss counter. You can only miss so many times. That means hitting the wrong target or not hitting the right target. I think you can get about 10 misses and then the game ends. So you might be wondering, what exactly does the name Hogan's Alley mean? Well, a Hogan's Alley is sort of a general term for these firearms training places here. There actually was an original Hogan's Alley. I believe it was designed by the US military. You'd go in there and suddenly various cutouts of people would pop up and you'd have to shoot the right ones. I guess this was to train your reflexes and judgment when it comes to handling a firearm. You've probably seen things like this maybe on TV or movies where someone has to train to become an FBI agent or a cop or something like that. I believe that the FBI had a Hogan's Alley in place about the same time this game came out. The police officer here is sort of interesting. He's smiling. On the other hand, he's also sort of holding his billy club and putting it in the palm of his hand, almost like he's kind of thinking he wants to smack you on the head with it. He does seem just a bit menacing. Okay, so then there's the Hogan's Alley B option. Here, instead of a standard shooting range, you're actually in some sort of alley mock-up, and the little figures appear in the windows and doorways and try to shoot at you. It's actually an awful lot like one of the options in Wild Gunman. Even at this stage, Nintendo is not above reusing the same ideas. And this is probably a bit more interesting than the first option. There's a bit more variety, you have, actual backgrounds in it. One thing I've always wondered, that one gangster, is he dressed up wearing a tuxedo? It was nice of him to put on such a formal get-up for this occasion. Now, one other thing that is quite notable here is that, as the scene switches, you'll see what appears to be the earliest instance of sideways scrolling in a Famicom game. One thing about the Famicom, it was designed so that it was very efficient at sideways scrolling, something that some of the other machines at the time, like the MSX computers, really could not do. When you think of the system, you tend to think of all those scrolling at games like Super Mario Bros. It's a little unusual that the Famicom has been out in the market for a year, and this is the first game that we've seen that actually utilizes scrolling. Well, there's one final variation here, and it's called Trick Shot. This is where you shoot at cans and try to keep them sort of, up in the air, and get them to land on a platform. You'll then get some points depending on which platform you land them on. And why does the music from this sound like something from an old Small Faces song? Maybe it's just a coincidence. Okay, so that wraps up the last game in this episode. So what did we learn here? Well, while none of these games are exactly bad, they're all reasonably well made, none of them are really that exciting. I think probably the game that most folks would remember would probably be Duck Hunt. Nothing wrong with Duck Hunt, it's just a very simplistic game. It was something that was kind of good to pull out at, parties or something, or for a little fun, but it's not really a game that I think people would normally put on their list of all-time favorite games or anything like that. Of course, a few of these games, such as Golf and Mahjong, ended up being very successful, at least in Japan. But for most of us, I think we'd still sort of think of the Famicom as being in sort of an experimental stage at this point. Hasn't really found its groove yet. You might say that the really interesting things didn't start to happen until 1985. And there you have it, Chrontendo Episode 1 Revised Edition. Hopefully it turned out a bit better than the original Episode 1, and maybe someday I'll get around to re-recording Episodes 2 and 3 as well. In the meantime, keep an eye out for actual brand new episodes of Chrontendo.